On a Tuesday afternoon in 1962, Richard McDonald climbed a ladder outside his own restaurant in San Bernardino, California, and removed the sign that bore his family name. The letters came off one at a time, McDonald''. He carried them down carefully, the way a man handles something that used to belong to him, set them on the asphalt behind the building, and stood there for a moment looking at the blank space on the wall where his identity had been for 22 years. Then he went back inside and hung a new sign. The big M, no golden arches, no familiar red and white, just two words that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been paying very close attention to what had just happened to the men who invented fast food. Across the street, a brand new McDonald's franchise was already under construction. Same name, same arches, same system. Built deliberately, precisely, within sight of the original, by the man who had purchased the right to do exactly that. Richard McDonald did not own the name McDonald's anymore. He did not own the system he had invented. He did not own the golden arches he had designed. He did not own the method that was, at that very moment, being replicated in 700 locations across the United States, serving 1 million customers a day using principles he had drawn in chalk on a tennis court 14 years earlier. He owned a building, he owned a grill, and he owned a new sign that said the Big M, which his old customers would have to learn to recognize if they wanted to keep eating at the place where all of it began. How does the man who invented fast food end up standing in a parking lot watching someone else build a restaurant with his name on it across the street from the one he no longer has the right to call his own? How does the system that revolutionized how an entire civilization eats get separated from the men who created it so completely that their own family name becomes the property of a stranger? And how does a 15-cent hamburger served through a window in a desert town in Southern California become the foundation of a $200 billion empire that feeds 69 million people every single day in 100 countries across the earth, while the men who made it possible die in a rented house and a nursing home, having lost not their fortune, not their health, but something far more difficult to recover? Their name. The answer, as it always is, begins somewhere no one was looking. In this case, a shoe factory in New Hampshire, a chalk line on a tennis court, and a 52-year-old milkshake machine salesman who drove into a parking lot in San Bernardino and saw something that nobody else had ever seen. Manchester, New Hampshire. 1920s. The city smelled like leather and machine oil. 20,000 men worked in the shoe factories that lined the Merrimack River, cutting, stitching, and assembling boots and dress shoes in buildings that ran 6 days a week, 50 weeks a year. Manchester was not a glamorous city. It was not a city that appeared in songs or postcards or in the dreams of people who lived elsewhere. It was a city built entirely around the assumption that leather would always need to be cut and stitched and assembled into shoes, and that the men who did the cutting and the stitching would always be needed, and that being needed was the same thing as being safe. Among those 20,000 men was Patrick McDonald, an Irish immigrant who had come to Manchester the way most of his neighbors had come, with nothing except the understanding that nothing was temporary if you worked hard enough for long enough. Patrick McDonald was a shift foreman at the G.P. Crafts shoe factory. He had held the position for 42 years, not 42 months, 42 years. He had walked through the same factory gates for more than 4 decades, managed the same production floor, trained 2 generations of workers, watched young men arrive as apprentices and leave as foremen themselves, and built his family's entire existence around the certainty that the job would be there tomorrow because it had been there yesterday and every day before that for as long as anyone in the McDonald household could remember. He had 2 sons, Maurice, born in 1902, who everyone called Mac, Richard, born in 1909, who everyone called Dick. They grew up in the rhythm of a factory town, the morning whistle that pulled their father out of bed, the evening return, the smell of leather and machine grease on his clothes, the modest house that the factory wages paid for, the understanding absorbed through years of proximity rather than any single conversation, that a man's worth in Manchester was measured by the reliability of his attendance and the steadiness of his hands. In the late 1920s, the shoe industry in New England began to contract. Factories that had employed thousands for generations started closing or relocating to the south, where labor was cheaper and unions were weaker. The great migration of American manufacturing away from the communities that had built it and depended on it, a pattern that would repeat itself across the country for the next 100 years, was already underway. The GP Crafts factory was not immune. Patrick McDonald, after 42 years of service, was told he was too old to do the job anymore. He was let go. No pension. No severance, no gold watch, no ceremony, no acknowledgement of any kind that a man had given 4 decades of his waking life to an institution that had just decided he was no longer worth the cost of keeping. 42 years, more than 15,000 mornings walking through the same gate, and the gate closed behind him for the last time as quietly as it had opened on the first. Patrick McDonald went home and told his sons what had happened. Mac was 26. Dick was 19. They were young enough to be angry and old enough to understand exactly what they were angry about. They had just watched the American industrial economy do to their father what it would do to hundreds of thousands of other men in the decades to come. Extract a lifetime of labor and return nothing when the extraction was complete. No safety net, no recognition, not even the courtesy of an explanation that acknowledged the man as something more than an entry on a ledger that no longer balanced. The brothers made a vow that would govern every decision they made for the next 30 years. They would make $1 million each by the time they turned 50. Not because they wanted to be rich, not because they dreamed of mansions or motor cars or the kind of wealth that announces itself, because they had watched what happened to a man who wasn't, because they had seen in their father's face the specific expression of a person who discovers that loyalty is not a contract, that showing up is not a guarantee, and that the only security available in the American economy is the security you build for yourself with your own hands. They left New Hampshire. They went to California. They went where everyone in the 1930s went when the life they had did not resemble the life they wanted. West, into the sun, toward the only horizon in America that still looked like it had room, Hollywood 1930. Mac and Dick McDonald arrived in Los Angeles with almost no money, no connections, and the same blind faith in the geography of California that had been pulling Americans westward for 100 years. Los Angeles in 1930 was a city in the middle of becoming something it had never been before. The population had exploded from barely 100,000 at the turn of the century to over 1 million. The movie studios were hiring. The oil fields were producing. The climate was an advertisement that wrote itself. And the automobile, which in the rest of the country was still a tool, had become in Los Angeles something closer to an organ. The city did not function without it. The distances between neighborhoods, between home and work, between any 2 points that a person might need to reach in a given day, were designed around the assumption that everyone would drive. The brothers got jobs as set movers at Columbia Pictures, hauling scenery and equipment across studio lots for wages that kept them alive, but did not bring them meaningfully closer to the $1 million they had promised each other in their father's kitchen in Manchester. They moved props. They built backdrops. They watched actors pretend to be wealthy on sets constructed from plywood and paint, and they understood instinctively the difference between the performance of success and the mechanics of it. Hollywood was a factory that manufactured illusions. The brothers wanted to manufacture something real. They tried the movie theater business. They scraped together enough money to open a small cinema near their apartment. It failed. The timing was wrong, the location was wrong, or perhaps the movie theater business was simply not the kind of business that rewarded the particular combination of stubbornness and precision that the McDonald brothers carried with them from New Hampshire. They looked around for something else. They looked at what people in Southern California seemed to need and could not easily get, and what they saw was this. The automobile had already reorganized the entire geography of daily life. People ate in their cars. They socialized in their cars. The drive-in restaurant, a uniquely Californian invention, had become the center of a food culture that was growing faster than the traditional restaurant industry could accommodate. Car hops on roller skates, neon signs visible from a quarter mile, parking lots designed like amphitheaters with the kitchen as a stage. It was loud, it was fast, it was American in a way that nothing on the East Coast had yet figured out how to be. In 1937, the McDonald brothers opened a tiny octagonal food stand near the Monrovia Airport, east of Los Angeles. They called it the Airdrome. It was barely large enough for two men to work inside. They sold hot dogs for 10 cents and orange juice for a nickel from a window cut into the side of the building. There was no seating. There was no table service. There were no car hops. Just two brothers from New Hampshire selling food through a hole in a wall to people who were in too much of a hurry to sit down. It was small, it was simple, and it made money. Not a lot of money, but enough to confirm something the brothers had suspected since watching their father come home empty-handed from the shoe factory. The thing that fed people would always make money because the thing that fed people would always be needed. You could lose your job. You could not lose your appetite. In 1940, they moved the operation 40 miles east to San Bernardino, a desert city on Route 66, where the traffic was heavier and the opportunities were bigger. San Bernardino in 1940 was a crossroads. Route 66, the most famous highway in the United States, ran straight through town carrying a river of travelers, truckers, and families moving between the Midwest and the Pacific Coast. The nearby military bases, Marchfield and Norton Air Force Base, flooded the city with thousands of young servicemen who had money in their pockets and nowhere in particular to spend it. The brothers renamed their operation McDonald's Famous Barbecue and built a proper drive-in restaurant at the corner of 14th and East Streets. 25 items on the menu: barbecue ribs, pulled pork, beef sandwiches, tamales, chili, ham, and beans. A full car hop service with 20 young women on roller skates carrying trays to customers parked in a lot that held 125 cars. The building had a distinctive octagonal shape. The car hops wore matching uniforms. The neon sign glowed against the desert sky at night and could be seen from 3 blocks away. Within 2 years, McDonald's Famous Barbecue was the most popular drive-in in San Bernardino. Within 5 years, it was the most popular drive-in in the entire region. By 1947, the brothers were pulling in $200,000 a year in gross revenue, which in 1947 dollars was an extraordinary sum for a restaurant of any kind, let alone a drive-in on a desert highway. In today's terms, that is roughly $2.7 million. They had bought a house in a good neighborhood. They had 3 Cadillacs in the driveway. They had built a tennis court behind the house. They had hired a gardener. They had, by any reasonable measure, already accomplished what they had set out to do when they left New Hampshire with nothing but their father's humiliation as motivation. And then Dick McDonald did something that nobody in the restaurant industry had ever done before, and that most restaurant owners would consider clinically insane. He looked at the most successful restaurant in the city, his own restaurant, the business that had made him wealthy, the operation that was working exactly as designed, and he said, "This is wrong. The whole thing is wrong, and I'm going to tear it down and start over." The problem was not the food. The problem was not the location. The problem was not the customers, who arrived in such numbers that the parking lot overflowed every Friday and Saturday night. The problem was the system, or more precisely, the absence of one. Dick McDonald had been studying his own operation for months with the quiet, obsessive attention of a man who suspects that something is broken and will not stop looking until he finds where. What he saw behind the polished chrome counters and the smiling car hops and the overflowing parking lot was this: chaos managed by charm. The car hops were constantly breaking dishes, ceramic plates, glass cups, metal flatware. The replacement cost for dishes alone was consuming 5% of gross revenue. That is $10,000 a year in 1947 dollars thrown into a garbage bin in the form of broken crockery. Teenage customers, who made up a large portion of the evening crowd, were loud, drove fast, left cigarette butts in the parking lot, and attracted the kind of trouble that made families with young children avoid the restaurant after dark. The kitchen was a bottleneck where skilled short-order cooks performed dozens of different tasks in unpredictable sequences, working from a 25-item menu that required a different set of ingredients, a different preparation method, and a different cooking time for nearly every order. The resulting wait time from order to delivery was sometimes 15 minutes, sometimes 20, sometimes 30, on a busy night when every car hop was juggling 6 tables and the kitchen was backed up with barbecue orders that took twice as long as anything else on the menu. This wait time was accepted as normal only because every other drive-in in America had exactly the same problem. The entire restaurant industry had organized itself around the assumption that food takes time, that service requires people, and that people are inherently slow. Dick McDonald looked at that assumption and asked a question that sounded almost childish in its simplicity. Why? But the number that changed everything was simpler than any of those. Dick McDonald went through his sales records, receipt by receipt, week by week, month by month, and discovered that 80% of his revenue came from hamburgers, not ribs, not barbecue, not tamales, not pulled pork, not the 25-item menu that required a kitchen full of skilled cooks and a staff of 20 car hops to deliver. Hamburgers, a single product that represented 4/5 of every dollar his restaurant earned. He was running a barbecue restaurant. He was making money on hamburgers. The entire operation, the car hops, the dishes, the complex menu, the skilled cooks, the 15-minute wait times, all of it was infrastructure built to serve the 20%, while the 80% waited in line behind it. In October 1948, Dick and Mac McDonald closed their restaurant. Not temporarily, not for renovation, not for a long weekend. They shut the entire operation down. They fired every one of the 20 car hops. They ripped out the barbecue pit. They eliminated 2/3 of the menu. They took every plate, every glass, every piece of metal flatware in the building and threw them away. All of it, into the garbage. And they replaced them with paper bags and paper cups and wax paper wrappers that cost a fraction of a cent each and never needed to be washed, never needed to be replaced, and never broke when a car hop tripped on a curb. Their friends thought they had lost their minds. Their accountant thought they had lost their minds. Their former car hops, many of whom had worked at the restaurant for years, were furious and bewildered in equal measure. Their regular customers drove past the shuttered building and wondered what had happened to the most popular restaurant in San Bernardino. The brothers had just destroyed the most profitable restaurant in the city, voluntarily, without external pressure of any kind, without a financial crisis, without a competitor forcing their hand. Because one of them had done the math, and the math said the whole thing was built wrong. And Dick McDonald trusted the math more than he trusted the evidence of his own success. What happened next took place on a tennis court. Behind their house on the outskirts of San Bernardino, Dick and Mac McDonald walked onto the tennis court they had built with their barbecue profits, and they got down on their hands and knees with sticks of white chalk. What they drew was not a restaurant layout. It was a manufacturing diagram. Dick McDonald, who had never been inside a factory in his life, who had left New Hampshire specifically to escape the industrial economy that had consumed his father, who had no engineering training, no exposure to Frederick Taylor's scientific management, no formal knowledge of Henry Ford's assembly line principles beyond what any ordinary American might absorb from living in a country that Ford had physically reshaped, drew a production system on that tennis court that would do to food what Ford's moving chassis line had done to automobiles 35 years earlier at Highland Park. Every piece of equipment was drawn to exact scale on the concrete surface. The grill here, positioned at the center of the operation, large enough to cook 40 patties at once. The bun toaster there, directly adjacent so that the man working the grill could slide a finished patty onto a toasted bun without turning around. The condiment station at precisely this distance from the assembly point, stocked with pre-measured portions of ketchup, mustard, onions, and 2 pickle slices per burger, so that the man applying condiments never had to reach, never had to search, never had to make a decision. The French fry station positioned so that a man turning from the fryer could pass the fries to the bagging station in a single motion without taking a step. The milkshake machines in a row along the back wall, fed by pre-mixed formula that eliminated the need to measure ingredients for every individual shake. Every movement measured, every step counted, every second between the moment an order was placed at the window and the moment a finished hamburger reached the customer's hand accounted for and minimized. They hired their employees back, the ones who were willing to return, and ran them through the system on the tennis court. Not in a kitchen, on a tennis court. Grown men standing on chalk lines in the California sun, miming the preparation of food that did not exist, rehearsing the choreography of a restaurant that had not yet been built, pivoting from one imaginary station to the next, passing invisible hamburgers down an invisible line, pretending to flip patties on a grill that was a chalk rectangle, pretending to bag fries from a fryer that was a white outline on gray concrete, over and over, for hours, adjusting the distances between stations by inches when Dick noticed that a man took one step too many between the grill and the counter. Moving the chalk lines, running the simulation again. 3 times they erased the entire layout and redrew it from scratch because the flow was not right, because a man had to reach too far, because a hand crossed the path of another hand, because 2 seconds could become 1 if the station was 6 inches closer to the assembly point. The neighbors must have thought they were watching a very unusual game of tennis. They called it the Speedee service system, and when the restaurant reopened in December 1948, 3 months after the shutdown, with nothing on the menu but hamburgers, cheeseburgers, French fries, milkshakes, soft drinks, and pie, the people of San Bernardino did not understand what they were looking at. There were no car hops. There were no plates. There was no table service of any kind. There were no waitresses, no menus to browse, no option to customize an order. Customers walked up to a window, placed an order from a list of 9 items posted on the wall, and received their food in a paper bag. A complete hamburger, bun, ketchup, mustard, onions, and 2 pickles for 15 cents. Not 30 cents, which was the going rate at every other drive-in in the city. 15 cents, half the price. And the food arrived not in 20 minutes, not in 10, not in 5, in 30 seconds. 30 seconds, the time it takes to tie a shoe. The initial reaction was hostility. The car hops the brothers had fired came back and stood outside the window, heckling them, asking when they should come in to pick up their uniforms. Regular customers pulled into the lot, sat in their cars waiting for someone to come to their window, and after 5 minutes of no one appearing, drove away angry. Others walked to the counter, looked at the 9-item menu, and demanded to know where the barbecue went, where the tamales went, where the 25 options they had been choosing from for the last 8 years went. For the first 3 months, revenue collapsed. The brothers had bet everything on a system that the people it was designed to serve did not want and could not understand. December, January, February. 3 months of empty parking lots and angry faces, and the quiet terror of 2 men who had just dismantled the most profitable business they had ever built on the faith that the math was right even when the evidence said otherwise. Then in the spring of 1949, something shifted. Not the system, the customers. A different kind of customer. A kind of customer that the old McDonald's, the car hop McDonald's, the 25-item menu McDonald's had never specifically attracted and never specifically served. Working men on lunch breaks who had 30 minutes to eat and no interest in waiting 20 of them for a car hop to notice they existed. Families with 3 children who could feed everyone for under $1, which at any sit-down restaurant in 1948 was simply not possible. Construction workers from the highway projects east of town, truck drivers running Route 66 who needed to eat without stopping for more than 5 minutes. Mothers who could hand a bag of food through the car window to kids in the back seat without turning off the engine. People who measured time and money and had never once in their lives been offered a way to convert less of one into more of the other at a restaurant counter. The new customers came in waves. By the spring of 1949, McDonald's was busier than it had ever been under the old system. Not slightly busier. The lines stretched from the service window to the edge of the parking lot, and then beyond it onto the sidewalk on E Street. By 1950, annual revenue had surpassed the barbecue years. By 1951, it had doubled them. By 1953, the brothers were each earning over $100,000 in personal income from a restaurant that sold nothing but hamburgers through a window to people who carried them away in paper bags. They had done it. They had reached the $1 million goal they had set for themselves in their father's kitchen in Manchester, New Hampshire, 25 years earlier, while the shoe factories were closing and the future looked like nothing but more of the same. And they had done something larger than they realized at the time. They had proven on a chalk-drawn tennis court in the California desert that the assembly line was not limited to factories. That the same principle, the same relentless logic of sequence and specialization and the elimination of unnecessary movement could be applied to anything. A hamburger was not a Model T. A kitchen was not a factory floor. But the math underneath both of them was identical. Divide the labor, simplify the task, move the product, never stop. The American magazine ran a cover story in 1952 about the McDonald brothers and their extraordinary restaurant in San Bernardino. The article described the system in detail and included photographs of the kitchen layout, the serving window, the paper bag operation, and the lines of customers that formed every day at lunch and dinner. The article was read by restaurant owners and businessmen across the country. Within weeks, letters began arriving at the restaurant. Phone calls. Visitors who drove to San Bernardino specifically to stand in line, order a 15-cent hamburger, and watch the system operate from the customer side of the window, the way an engineer watches a machine he is thinking about buying. They all asked the same question: can I build one of these in my city? The brothers looked at each other and saw the next stage of the promise. Not one restaurant, many. The system was the product, and the product could be copied. They needed a building that was as standardized as the kitchen inside it. They hired an architect. Stanley Meston worked out of Fontana, California, and the McDonald brothers gave him a brief that no restaurant architect had ever received. They did not want a building that looked like a restaurant. They wanted a building that looked like the future, something visible from a quarter mile down the highway, something that grabbed the eye of a driver moving at 45 miles an hour and did not let go until the car was in the parking lot. Dick McDonald sketched 2 yellow arches on a napkin. Not golden yet, just yellow. Structural arches built into the sides of the building itself, rising 25 feet above the roofline, trimmed in neon tubing that turned them into 2 glowing parabolas, visible from every direction at night. Meston took the sketch and took Dick back to the tennis court, where they drew the new kitchen layout in chalk at full scale, with Meston's assistant Charles Fish measuring every dimension with a tape measure while the brothers argued about inches. They produced a building design that stopped traffic, literally. Red and white ceramic tile on every surface, stainless steel counters, bright sheet metal panels in red, white, and yellow. Glass walls that let customers see inside the kitchen the way visitors at Highland Park had once seen inside Henry Ford's Crystal Palace. Everything visible, everything clean, everything moving. A restaurant designed not to look like a place where food was prepared, but like a machine that happened to produce food, because that is exactly what it was. The first franchise opened on May 15, 1953, in Phoenix, Arizona. A gas station distributor named Neil Fox paid the McDonald brothers $1,000 for the right to use their name, their system, and Meston's Golden Arches building design. $1,000, a flat fee, no percentage of revenue, no ongoing royalty, no contractual mechanism of any kind to capture the value of the system as it grew beyond a single location. $1,000 for a system that would eventually generate more than $23 billion in annual revenue across 40,000 restaurants in over 100 countries. The brothers were not businessmen. They were system builders. They understood flow and sequence and the elimination of wasted motion. They did not understand leverage, scalability, or the compounding mathematics of a royalty clause. The difference would cost them everything. By 1954, there were a handful of franchises scattered across California and Arizona, each operating under loose agreements that gave the brothers minimal control over quality, minimal revenue from the franchisees' operations, and minimal ability to enforce the standards that made the system work. A previous franchise manager named Bill Tansey had quit due to poor health, and the brothers had not replaced him. They were running an expanding national franchise network from the counter of their San Bernardino restaurant, between the lunch rush and the dinner rush, with the organizational infrastructure of a lemonade stand. They needed help. They knew they needed help. They did not know what kind of help was driving toward them across the Mojave Desert in a dusty car with a trunk full of milkshake machines and a lifetime of failure that had prepared him with surgical precision for this exact moment. In the summer of 1954, a 52-year-old traveling salesman from Oak Park, Illinois, named Ray Kroc pulled into the parking lot of McDonald's restaurant at 1398 North E Street in San Bernardino, California. He had been selling multi-mixer milkshake machines for 17 years, 5 spindle machines that could make 5 shakes simultaneously. Most of his clients were restaurants and soda fountains that ordered 1, maybe 2 machines. Business had been declining. The soda fountain was dying. The multi-spindle milkshake mixer was a product whose market was quietly evaporating. Kroc was 52 years old, had diabetes, had already lost his gallbladder, and was driving across America trying to sell a machine that fewer people needed every year. Then he received an order from a hamburger restaurant in San Bernardino, California, for 8 multi-mixers, 8 machines, 40 milkshakes at once, from a single restaurant on a desert highway. Kroc drove halfway across the country to understand that number. What he saw when he arrived was a line of people stretching from the service window to the edge of the parking lot. Working men, families, teenagers, housewives, people standing patiently, cheerfully in the California sun, waiting to buy a 15-cent hamburger through a hole in a wall. He stood in the parking lot and counted. He timed the transactions. He watched the speed at which the line moved and calculated in his head what that speed meant in dollars per hour, the way a man does when he has spent 3 decades selling things and can read the revenue of an operation the way a sailor reads the wind. Then he walked to the window and asked to see the kitchen. And what Ray Kroc saw in that kitchen was not a restaurant. It was a machine made of people. A system so precisely calibrated, so completely designed around the elimination of waste and the minimization of time, that the distance between a raw patty on a grill and a finished hamburger in a customer's hand had been compressed into something that barely qualified as a process. It was more like a reflex, an involuntary mechanical action performed by an organism that had been trained to do one thing perfectly and nothing else at all. The grill man flipped patties in a rhythm that never varied. The dresser applied condiments in an identical pattern to every single burger. The wrapper folded wax paper in 3 motions that had been practiced until they were automatic. No one spoke. No one hesitated. No one made a decision that had not already been made for them by the system they were operating inside of. Ray Kroc had been looking for something his entire adult life. He had sold paper cups for Lily Tulip. He had played piano in speakeasies. He had sold real estate in Florida during the boom and lost everything in the bust. He had sold milkshake machines to a shrinking market for nearly 2 decades. He had failed at enough things to fill a resume and succeeded at none of them in the way that mattered to a man who was 52 years old and still driving across the country alone with a trunk full of inventory and a conviction, growing dimmer every year, that the thing he was meant to do was still out there waiting for him. What he saw in San Bernardino was not a hamburger restaurant. It was a system that could be replicated infinitely. Every McDonald's could be identical. Every hamburger could taste the same. Every customer experience could be predictable down to the second. Every location could generate revenue with the mechanical reliability of a printing press, because that was exactly what it was. A machine for printing money, operated by interchangeable parts that happened to be human. He saw in that kitchen something the brothers had never seen, because they were too close to it, because they had built it with their own hands, because they loved it the way a craftsman loves his work, which is to say specifically and personally. Kroc did not love the system. He recognized it, the way a prospector recognizes gold, not with affection, with the pure white certainty that what he was looking at was worth more than anyone around him understood. Kroc approached the brothers that same afternoon. The conversation was direct. He wanted the national franchise rights to McDonald's. All of them. Everywhere. The brothers were hesitant. They had tried franchising. It had been a headache. They didn't want to travel. They didn't want to manage people in other cities. They liked their restaurant. They liked their tennis court. They liked San Bernardino. They had made their $1 million. They were content. But Kroc was persuasive in the way that only a man who has spent 30 years in sales and arrived at last at the one product he was born to sell can be persuasive, which is to say completely. They signed a contract. Kroc would recruit franchisees, enforce standards, and build out the national network. The brothers would receive 0.5% of gross sales from every franchise in the country. Not of profits, of gross sales. A royalty stream that would grow with every restaurant Kroc opened, for as long as the restaurants existed, in perpetuity. It was the most valuable clause in the most important restaurant contract in American history. Had it been honored, it would eventually have been worth $305 million a year to the McDonald family. Every year, forever. The brothers would never see a dollar of it. But that is a story for a different day. Because what happened next, what Ray Kroc did with the system that Dick McDonald drew in chalk on a tennis court, what he built and what he destroyed, and what he took from the men who gave it to him, is not the same story as the one we have just told. This is the story of two brothers from New Hampshire who watched their father lose everything after 42 years of loyalty to a factory that did not remember his name, who left for California with nothing except a promise to each other, who opened a hot dog stand, then a barbecue joint, then tore the barbecue joint apart with their own hands because the math said it was built wrong, who got down on their knees on a tennis court with sticks of chalk and designed the most efficient food preparation system the world had ever seen, who proved that a 15-cent hamburger served in 30 seconds could change an industry, a culture, and eventually an entire civilization's relationship with food, and who lost it all not to a competitor, not to a market shift, not to a failure of their own making, but to a man who understood something the brothers never did. The brothers understood the system. They understood the kitchen and the sequence and the spacing and the choreography of a perfectly timed operation. They understood how to make the thing work. They did not understand what the thing was worth. And in America, that has always been the difference between the man who invents and the man who owns. Mac McDonald died on December 11th, 1971, at the age of 69. His heart gave out. Family members said his health problems were connected to the stress of watching the empire that bore his name grow without him, knowing that the handshake agreement for ongoing royalties had never been put in writing and had never been honored, knowing that the original restaurant on Northeast Street had been deliberately driven out of business by a McDonald's franchise constructed across the street for the specific purpose of destroying it. Dick McDonald lived longer. He moved back to New Hampshire to a quiet house in Bedford, 20 miles from Manchester, 20 miles from the shoe factory where his father had lost everything after 42 years. He lived quietly. He did not give many interviews. He did not speak often about what had happened. Every year when McDonald's Corporation celebrated Founders Day in honor of Ray Kroc, Dick McDonald endured it in silence. It was not until 1991, 7 years after Kroc's death, that McDonald's corporate acknowledged in a television advertisement that Dick and Mac McDonald were the actual founders of the company that bears their name. Dick McDonald died on July 14, 1998, in a nursing home in Manchester, New Hampshire. He was 89 years old. He had come home, back to the city his father walked to work in for 42 years, back to the place where two boys made a promise and kept it, and then lost what they had earned and never fully understood why. On Northeast Street in San Bernardino, at the address where all of it began, the original building is gone. It was demolished in 1972. No one saved it. No historical society intervened. No plaque was placed. The building where fast food was invented was torn down and carted away in dumpsters, and the world did not notice because the world had 40,000 other buildings with the same name and the same arches and the same system operating inside them. And what did it need with the original? In its place today, there is a small, unofficial museum run by the owner of a local chicken restaurant who bought the property and filled it with artifacts he collected himself. Vintage packaging, old menus, photographs of two brothers on their knees on a tennis court with chalk in their hands, designing the future of food without knowing that the future would not include them. The museum sits on Route 66. Admission is free. Part of the original floor is still visible beneath the display cases. If you stand in the parking lot and look across the street, you can see the spot where Ray Kroc built the franchise that put the brothers out of business. That building is gone too. Nothing lasts on that stretch of road except the asphalt itself and the memory of what happened on it. 15 million Model Ts rolled out of Highland Park. Tens of billions of hamburgers have come off the system that Dick McDonald drew on a tennis court in 1948. Ford built a method, and the method outlived the factory. The McDonald's built a system, and the system outlived the men. The difference is that Ford kept his name on the building. The brothers lost theirs. And every single day, 69 million people walk into a restaurant called McDonald's. And not one of them knows that the name on the sign belongs to two brothers from New Hampshire who left home because their father was thrown away by a shoe factory after 42 years, who invented the most efficient food preparation system the world has ever seen on a tennis court with sticks of chalk, and who lost everything to a milkshake machine salesman who walked into their parking lot one afternoon in 1954 and saw what they had built and understood, in a way they never could, what it was worth. That is the thing about building something extraordinary. The world takes the building. It does not always take the builder.